I want to tell you about the moment the official explanation stopped making sense to me. I was reading a 1963 Turkish archaeological report, the kind of document that gets filed and forgotten, translated by nobody, cited by nobody, sitting in its original bureaucratic language in a university archive. And I came across a sentence that I had to read 3 times before I believed I understood it correctly. The sentence described the discovery by a local homeowner in the Nevşehir province of central Turkey of a room behind a wall in his basement. Not a hidden compartment, not a cellar extension. A room that connected to another room, which connected to a tunnel, which descended into a network of passages and chambers that the initial survey team, after 3 days of exploration, had not been able to fully map. The homeowner had knocked through a wall to expand his basement and found an underground city. Not a cave, not a natural formation, a city, with ventilation shafts, with wells, with stables and storage rooms and communal spaces, and what appeared to be places of worship, all carved from the volcanic tuff of the Cappadocian plateau with a precision and at a scale that the 1963 report described in the careful language of Turkish government archaeology as unexpected. Unexpected. I've spent a long time with that word. The official history of Derinkuyu is, on its surface, a coherent story. You learn that it is one of approximately 200 underground settlements discovered in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey. You learn that it descends approximately 85 meters into the earth across at least 18 levels, though only 8 have been opened to the public, and the survey of the lower levels has never, to my knowledge, been completed and published in full. You learn that it could, by the estimates of the Turkish authorities who manage it, have housed somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people. You learn that it has been provisionally dated to the Byzantine period, roughly the 7th to 10th centuries AD, and that the accepted explanation for its construction is that Christian communities in the region needed somewhere to hide from Arab raiding parties moving through Anatolia during the early Islamic expansion. Tidy, logical, reassuring. But the deeper I looked, the more that tidiness began to feel like a kind of performance. Let me take you somewhere specific. Stand in the entrance tunnel of Derinkuyu and look at the door, not through the door, at the door. It is a circular stone disc, approximately 1/2 meter thick, somewhere between 1 and 2 meters in diameter, depending on the level, and it rolls across the tunnel entrance from the inside. It can only be opened or closed by someone already underground. There is a small hole in the center of the disc through which, it has been suggested, defenders could insert a spear to hold off anyone trying to push the door open from the outside. This is sophisticated defensive engineering. It requires knowledge of leverage, of stone cutting tolerances, of how to shape a circular form that will roll smoothly and seal completely against a non-circular tunnel face. It requires the ability to execute that knowledge in volcanic tuff, working in confined underground spaces, with tools whose nature the official record is, at best, vague about. Now hold that image, that rolling stone door, that small hole for a spear, and ask a simple question. How long does it take to plan something like that? How long does it take to plan not one of them but dozens of them installed at intervals down 18 levels of a structure that, from the surface, gives no indication of existing at all? The official explanation is Byzantine Christians in the 7th century. Farmers and tradespeople with, presumably, the tools available to farmers and tradespeople in Byzantine Anatolia, who in their spare time between harvests and raids decided to excavate, by hand, in near total darkness, a vertical city capable of sustaining tens of thousands of lives indefinitely underground. This raises a simple but critical question. How? I want to be careful here. I want to be precise. I'm not suggesting that Byzantine Christians didn't use Derinkuyu. The evidence strongly suggests they did. What I'm questioning is the assumption that they built it. Because when you actually look at the structure, not at the tourist description, not at the official placard, but at the engineering, you encounter a problem the official account doesn't address. The problem is the air. Derinkuyu has approximately 15,000 ventilation shafts, Some of them are narrow, 20 to 50 centimeters in diameter, drilled vertically through 85 meters of volcanic tuff to the surface above. Think about what that requires. You need to know before you begin drilling exactly where you are in three-dimensional space relative to the surface. You need to maintain that orientation across 85 meters of descent through material you cannot see through. You need to calculate the angle necessary for each shaft to emerge at the correct surface location, avoid intersecting with other shafts, and maintain sufficient diameter to move air at the volume required to keep tens of thousands of people alive. And then you need to do it 15,000 times. The engineering precision required to drill 15,000 ventilation shafts through 85 meters of solid rock without modern survey equipment, without GPS, without reliable artificial light, is not something that emerges spontaneously from a community of farmers hiding from raids. It is the product of a systematic, advanced and institutionalized body of technical knowledge. Where is the record of that knowledge? The silence was deafening. Let me take you deeper. The lower levels of Derinkuyu, the levels below the 8th floor, the levels the Turkish authorities have not opened to the public and have, depending on who you ask, either not fully surveyed or not fully disclosed the surveys of, are described in fragments of documentation as containing chambers of unusual size. Not the relatively modest communal rooms of the upper levels, but spaces significantly larger. Some accounts describe a level somewhere between the 10th and 14th floor containing a chamber large enough to be called a hall with a vaulted ceiling, underground, in solid rock. I want you to hold that. A vaulted ceiling, underground. That's not a survival shelter. That's architecture. That's someone making a decision about the relationship between interior space and human experience, about how a room should feel as well as function, 60 or 70 meters below the surface of the earth, where nobody who was not already underground could ever see it. Who was that for? This is the question the official explanation cannot answer. If Derinkuyu was a refugee, a temporary emergency shelter for communities fleeing raids, you build for function. You build rooms large enough to hold people and livestock and food stores. You build passageways wide enough to move through. You do not build vaulted halls. You do not install rolling stone doors engineered to tolerances that would challenge a modern stonemason. You do not drill 15,000 precisely calibrated ventilation shafts. You survive. You do not build a civilization underground and then pretend to be a civilization above ground, unless the civilization underground came first. I want to be careful with that idea. Let me set it aside for a moment and take you somewhere else. Derinkuyu is not alone. In the Cappadocia region of Turkey, archaeologists have identified somewhere between 200 and 600 underground settlements, depending on how loosely you define the term. The variation in that number is itself interesting. It suggests the survey is ongoing, that the definition of what counts as a settlement is doing significant work, and that the total extent of the underground infrastructure in this region is not definitively established. Kaymakli, approximately 9 kilometers from Derinkuyu, is another major complex. They are connected, the official account acknowledges, by a tunnel approximately 9 kilometers long. A tunnel, 9 kilometers, underground, between two cities that the official record says were built by farming communities as temporary shelters. The tunnel between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli is wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. It has side chambers at intervals. It has, in certain sections, structural reinforcements that suggest it was intended for long-term use rather than emergency passage. It is, in engineering terms, infrastructure. It is not a bolt hole. It is not something you dig in a crisis. It is something you plan, execute and maintain across what must have been, given the precision of its execution, a considerable period of organized effort. Then travel further. The Longyu Caves in Zhejiang province, China, discovered in 1992, when local villagers drained ponds that turned out to be the flooded entrances to a complex of underground chambers. 36 caves. Total volume approximately 1 million cubic meters. The walls, the floors, the ceilings, every surface, covered in a consistent pattern of parallel chisel marks spaced approximately 60 centimeters apart. Not random tool marks, a deliberate, systematic, identical decorative treatment applied across every surface of a 1,000,000 cubic meter underground complex. No documentation of their construction exists anywhere in the local historical record. No tools, no debris, no record of the earth that was removed, and somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million cubic meters of rock was removed from those caves, none of which has been located. Where do you put 1,000,000 cubic meters of excavated rock without leaving a trace? The silence was deafening. The Ellora Caves in Maharashtra, India, a complex of 34 monastery temples carved directly from the Charanandri Hills across a cliff face approximately 2 kilometers wide. The Kailasa temple, the largest of them, required the removal of approximately 400,000 tons of rock, excavated from the top down, which is the opposite of how you would naturally approach a carving project, and which required the planners to visualize the entire finished structure in 3 dimensions before removing the first stone. It took, by the most generous estimates derived from the scale of the work and the tools assumed to have been available, somewhere between 18 and 200 years to complete, depending on the labor force assumed. No account of its construction exists, no contemporary documentation. The finished temple simply appears in the record. And then there are the rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, 11 of them, each carved from a single piece of rock from the top down, each with its own drainage system, its own ventilation, its own hydraulic engineering that channels rainwater away from the structures. Built, the official account says, in the 12th and 13th centuries in a remote highland region of Ethiopia by communities with access to iron chisels and the motivation of religious devotion. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Underground structures of extraordinary scale and sophistication appearing in the official record without documentation of their construction, attributed to periods and populations that, when you actually examine the logistics, struggle to account for what was built. And in each case, the official explanation is the same: religious motivation, emergency necessity, the combination of devoted labor and available time. What the official explanation doesn't account for is the geometry. When surveying teams have applied modern measurement to the underground complexes of Cappadocia, and some have, though the published results are scattered across Turkish, French, and German academic literature in ways that make synthesis difficult, they find a consistent geometric logic underlying the spatial organization of the structures. Room proportions that repeat, passage angles that follow specific relationships, vertical spacing between levels that conforms to ratios that are neither arbitrary nor obviously utilitarian. The same ratios, I should note, that appear in the proportional systems of the surface architecture we have examined in earlier investigations. The same underlying geometric logic that governs the relationship between tower width and tower height in cathedrals from Russia to Peru. Underground. What tradition of knowledge connects the surface and the subsurface? What school of geometry was sophisticated enough to govern both? Nobody seems to have asked, or if they asked, they did not publish the answer in a place I was able to find. Let me introduce you to a figure who has been quietly important to this story and has received almost no attention in English language discussions of Derinkuyu, Ömer Demir. A Turkish archaeologist who worked the Cappadocian underground sites from the 1970s through the 1990s and produced what is in many ways the most substantive systematic documentation of the region's underground architecture that exists. His work, published primarily in Turkish with some material in French academic journals, raises questions that the official English language treatment of Derinkuyu almost entirely ignores. Among them, the question of the wells. Derinkuyu has wells, multiple wells drilled from within the underground complex to the water table below. These wells, Demir noted in a 1981 paper that I had translated at considerable effort, do not simply reach water. They reach water at a consistent depth from multiple starting points at different levels within the complex, through a method of drilling that Demir described as demonstrating knowledge of subsurface hydrology that he found difficult to attribute to the period of supposed construction. What Demir was careful not to say directly, but what the logic of his argument implies, is that whoever drilled those wells knew where the water was before they started drilling. They knew the depth of the water table, its horizontal extent, its relationship to the surface geology. They drilled to it with sufficient precision that multiple wells from multiple levels of a structure distributed across 85 vertical meters all hit water reliably. That is not guesswork. That is not piety. That is the application of a systematic body of knowledge about how water moves through rock. Knowledge that was not, as far as the official record of Byzantine Anatolia indicates, available to Byzantine Anatolians. Demir died in 2006. His archive, I was informed by a colleague at Ankara University who was generous enough to respond to my inquiry, is partially held at the university, partially with his family, and has not been systematically digitized or made available to international researchers. There are, I was told, field notes from survey expeditions in the 1980s that have not been published in any form. The deeper I went, the more clearly this pattern appeared. The researcher who gets closest to the anomaly, who produces the most precise documentation, whose work most directly challenges the official explanation. That researchers' work is also the work that is hardest to access, least translated, most incompletely archived, not suppressed, not erased, simply through the ordinary mechanisms of academic inaccessibility and institutional inertia, unavailable. The silence was deafening. Here is what I find most interesting about the way Derinkuyu is presented to the public. When you read the tourist descriptions, when you read the standard English language archaeological summaries, you encounter a very consistent set of decisions about what to foreground and what to leave in the background. What is foregrounded? The human story, the Christian communities, the fear of Arab raiders, the ingenuity of ordinary people protecting their families. This is a compelling narrative. It is emotionally resonant. It positions the builders as admirable, relatable, comprehensible. It asks nothing of the reader except sympathy. What is left in the background, the engineering, the 15,000 ventilation shafts, the 9-kilometer tunnel to Kaymakli, the wells drilled to precise hydrological depth, the vaulted halls 60 meters underground, the rolling stone doors machined to tolerances that imply systematic technical knowledge, the geometric ratios that appear, when measured, to connect to a broader tradition of architectural proportion. These details are not hidden. They appear in the specialist publications, in the survey reports. They simply do not appear in the version of the story that reaches most people. The version that reaches most people is the version in which Derinkuyu is explicable. I want to ask why that is the version that travels, not as a conspiracy, not as coordinated suppression, but as a structural tendency of institutional knowledge management toward the version of events that requires the least revision of established frameworks. Derinkuyu fits comfortably into the established framework if you foreground the humans and background the engineering. It stops fitting the moment you look at the engineering first, and here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. If Derinkuyu's engineering doesn't fit the Byzantine Christian explanation, we need another explanation for when and by whom it was built. And the moment you start looking for that explanation, you run into a silence that is not accidental in the way that silences around the most consequential archaeological questions tend not to be accidental. The Hittites occupied Cappadocia before the Byzantines. Their civilization peaked around 1600 to 1200 BC and left substantial surface remains throughout the region. No Hittite source, as far as I have been able to determine, documents the construction of underground cities. The Phrygians came after the Hittites, then the Persians, then Alexander, then Rome, then Byzantium. 7 civilizations occupied this landscape over roughly 3,000 years, and in the record of not one of them does the construction of an underground city appear as a documented event. Derinkuyu existed in every one of those periods as presumably a feature of the landscape, but nobody built it. Nobody wrote about building it. Nobody recorded the labour, the organisation, the decision, the completion. A structure that could house 50,000 people was built at some point in the human past. The humans present, when it was built, did not record that they built it. Read that again. What does it mean for something to exist without having been made? What does it mean for 15,000 ventilation shafts to be drilled through 85 metres of rock without a record of the drilling? Not just missing records. We understand that fire and time and conquest destroy documentation. But what's missing here isn't only the record, it's the tradition, the knowledge of how to do this, the institutional memory of having done it, the lineage of craftsmen who carried the skill. All of it is simply absent from every civilization that demonstrably occupied this territory, as if it was already there when they arrived. I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you that Derinkuyu was built by a civilization that predates every civilization in our conventional timeline. I don't know that. The honest answer is that nobody knows when Derinkuyu was built, because nobody has produced a credible, comprehensive answer to who could have built it. The official dating is provisional. It is based largely on the artifacts and historical references associated with the Byzantine use of the complex, not on any analysis of the construction itself. Volcanic tuff does not lend itself to conventional dating methods the way that organic material does. The rock does not tell you when it was cut. It only tells you that it was cut, with considerable precision. What that precision implies about the knowledge required to achieve it is the question the official account asks us not to sit with too long. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. At Göbekli Tepe, approximately 600 kilometers southeast of Cappadocia, archaeologists beginning in the 1990s discovered a complex of carved stone enclosures that pushed the accepted timeline of organized human construction back by at least 6,000 years. The site predates agriculture, it predates pottery, it predates every established marker of the kind of social organization that was supposed to be a precondition for monumental construction. It simply shouldn't exist at the moment in human history when it was built. It existed. The researcher who first excavated it systematically, Klaus Schmidt, spent the last 2 decades of his life making a careful, conservative case for what the site implies. He died in 2014. The upper layers of Göbekli Tepe, the layers corresponding to the later periods of its use, were deliberately backfilled. The site was intentionally buried. Someone at some point made the decision to cover it over with earth and walk away. Who buries a temple? Who covers something over and leaves it? The same question applies underground. Who builds a city beneath the surface, builds it with extraordinary precision and evident permanence, and then leaves no trace in the historical record that they were ever there? I have been sitting with that question for a long time. I don't have a tidy answer. What I have is the structure. What I have is the engineering. What I have is the growing conviction that Derinkuyu is not an anomaly, that it belongs to a pattern of evidence that points, when you assemble it with care, toward a body of knowledge that was once systematically applied across a very wide geography, and that is now, for reasons we cannot fully reconstruct, absent from every account of human history we have been given. A knowledge of how to live underground, of how to supply air and water to tens of thousands of people in the dark, of how to orient that life in relationship to the surface above. The well is drilled to the exact depth of the water table, the ventilation shafts calibrated to move air across 85 meters of vertical distance, the tunnel to Kaymakli maintaining its direction across 9 kilometers without modern survey instruments. Someone understood the earth the way we understand it now. Or better, someone understood it well enough to carve a city into it and leave that city standing for how long? We don't know. Long enough that every civilization to subsequently occupy the surface above found it already there and used it without, as far as the record shows, thinking to ask who built it. That absence of curiosity is perhaps the strangest part. Because if I moved into a house and found in the basement a staircase descending to 18 floors of precisely engineered underground infrastructure capable of sustaining my entire city, my first question would not be, how do I use this? My first question would be, who built this? When? How? And why? The civilizations of Cappadocia did not seem to ask that question. Or if they asked it, the answer they received is not in any record I have been able to find. That silence, that absence of curiosity about something that demands curiosity, is perhaps the most unsettling thing I have encountered in this investigation. Because in curiosity about the extraordinary is not natural. It is learned, or it is inherited, or it is the mark of a civilization for whom the extraordinary infrastructure beneath its feet was simply always there, taken for granted, used and maintained without wonder, the way we use roads without asking who first cleared the path. What would it mean for Derinkuyu to have been not a refuge constructed in crisis, but simply infrastructure? Part of the built environment of a civilization that operated both above and below the surface. That understood the relationship between underground shelter and surface life as a permanent feature of human settlement rather than an emergency measure. A civilization that drilled ventilation shafts and hydrological wells and connected its underground cities with tunnels, not because it was afraid, but because that was how it built. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The complex goes down 85 meters. 8 levels are open to the public. The survey of the lower levels has never been published in full. The tunnel to Kaymakli is documented but not completely mapped. The surveys of Ömer Demir sit in a partially digitized archive in Ankara, in Turkish, unavailable to most researchers who might ask the questions his work was moving toward. The door rolls across the entrance from the inside. Whatever is down there, whatever was built by whoever built it, for whatever purpose they had in mind when they drilled 15,000 holes through 85 meters of rock and carved a vaulted hall where no sunlight has ever reached, is still down there. We stopped looking. I don't know why the looking was stopped. I know that it was. I know that the questions were filed in the same institutional spaces where the surveys of Ömer Demir were filed, and where the lower level reports were filed, and where whatever was found at the bottom of the 18th floor was filed, accurately catalogued, legitimately archived, accessible in principle and in practice, simply not there when you reach for them. The stone keeps standing. And 85 meters below the surface of the Cappadocian plateau, in levels that have not been opened, in chambers that have not been published, in a structure whose builders left no name, no date, no account of their knowledge or their reasons, something waits for the question. Nobody has been willing to ask loudly enough. Who went underground? And why haven't we followed them?